I recently flew from Los Angeles to Houston, and I was scrolling Netflix looking for some films to watch on the plane ride home. Netflix very rarely has films from the 20th century, much less the 1970s, but I was surprised to see 3 of the 4 Airport films streaming. Airport was a franchise I knew by name only. The original Airport grossed over $600 million when adjusted for inflation, making it among the 50 highest grossing films ever made. But if you look at that list, which features films like Gone with the Wind or Titanic, Airport is among the least known today. In fact, the film that spoofed it, Airplane, is far more well known to film fans now, and this mega hit has basically faded into obscurity. And I can't quite understand why. In addition to its monumental box office pool, it spawned 3 sequels and was nominated for 10 Academy Awards. And despite the fact that I watched the first 3 plane disaster films while on a plane ride, I was completely engrossed. They are terrible. And it makes me wonder what is going on with this franchise and why should you drop everything and watch them all right now? This is when the pictures got bigger, and in today's episode, we're taking to the skies.
The characters in the film are as shallow as a bird bath, and their behavior makes no sense at all. The only parts of the film that are interesting are when we think the plane might go down. And that's kind of sick, I guess.
In 1968, Arthur Haley released a novel called Airport, which follows an airport manager who does his best to keep operations running during an unruly snowstorm. He must handle everything from an old lady who sneaks onto his planes to a suicide bomber currently aboard a Boeing with plans to end it all while aboard. At the time, the production of this film was a huge deal. The cast list was as long as the film itself, and it was basically a who's who of big stars at the time. It also cost $10 million to make, but that was nothing compared to the $128 million it pulled in, making it the second highest grossing film of the year, behind Love Story of all things.
Love means never having to say you're sorry.
Still, $128 million is nothing to overlook. Like I said, top 50 gross of all time here. And it not only spawned 3 sequels and 2 spoofs, it essentially ushered in the disaster film boom of the 70s itself. Behind the camera, we're looking at A-listers in all departments. Alfred Newman scored the film, and it was the final piece he ever scored, as he would die just before the film was released. Edith Head was on costumes, too, and she'd be one of the film's 10 Oscar nods. We're also looking at nominations for Best Picture, Best Cinematography, and Helen Hayes, the elderly stowaway mentioned earlier, would actually go on to win Best Supporting Actress.
Here is Helen Hayes.
This may just sound like statistics, but it's very rare that we see a film do so well critically when nobody liked it, even upon release. The film's star, Burt Lancaster, literally called it the biggest piece of junk ever made, and that was while it was up for Oscars. Yet when I watched it on the plane, I couldn't look away. I don't know if I've ever felt for a film the way I felt for Airport. I know it's not good. Every character is a cliche, there's a disregard for fidelity that is bad by even 1970 standards, and for a disaster film, the disaster doesn't even begin until around the 2-hour mark. But I've already seen it twice. I tend to roll my eyes when people say they don't make films like this anymore, but at the very least, they don't make bad films the way they used to. Bad films today are boring at best and unfinished at worst, but Airport is not boring, nor is it unfinished. It's just really wild. For starters, the film takes place during a snowstorm, but when filming started, snow was nowhere to be found, meaning the snow seen in the film is bleached sawdust. The plane was real, though, a Boeing 707. Unfortunately, it would meet a tragic fate in 1989 when it crashed while landing in Sao Paulo, Brazil. Considering some of the lines in this film, that is pretty sweet irony.
Remind me to send a thank you note to Mr. Boeing.
Beyond that, the dialogue is just great. We get some expository scenes that just, well, they serve their function.
A week ago, I didn't know we'd have the worst storm in 6 years.
You've always got some damn excuse.
It's the kind of writing that gives Airport its charm, and despite several actors saying they couldn't stand the film, there's a level of earnestness to every performance. Helen Hayes, as mentioned earlier, won an Oscar for playing the elderly stowaway, and she steals the show every time she's on screen. And for a multi-million-dollar production, there's very little sugarcoating here. Near the end of the film, Dean Martin walks past his wife while holding the hand of his pregnant mistress. He doesn't even acknowledge her, and instead of following Martin, the camera holds on his wife, who has done absolutely nothing wrong, and comes to greet her husband after learning he nearly died in a plane crash. Airport doesn't care at all. All of this lends itself to a movie unlike any other, and I foolishly believe that this would be a single occurrence. Surely they couldn't replicate this success, say, 5 years later. Okay, so Airport 75 was actually released in 1974, but it sounded cooler to say 75. And this film takes pretty much everything good about the original and completely trashes it. Airport was a good film verging on bad. This is a terrible film verging on bad. And they are both great. There aren't very many similarities to the first film. We're in a different part of the country following an almost entirely new cast. The only returning face here is George Kennedy as Joe Petroni. In the first film, Petroni is a wisecracking chief mechanic, but he's back here as the vice president of operations. I mean, that's an interesting promotion path there. He's in all 4 films, actually. In the third, he's a consultant for Jimmy Stewart. And then in the fourth film, he's a senior pilot. I don't really understand, to be honest. I mean, the plot even makes less sense than Petroni's employment path. We're on a Boeing 747 this time, and after all of the talk last film about how safe it is to fly a Boeing, the disaster strikes when a small plane literally crashes into the cockpit of the 747, killing all of the pilots and causing the flight attendant Karen Black to have to take over the controls. They try and explain it, but they know nobody cares. One of my favorite scenes is when they try and fly a helicopter next to the 747 and lower a replacement pilot down through the open cockpit, but he falls off of the ladder and is also killed. It's good stuff. By the way, that small plane would go on to actually crash into another plane in 1989, so we're on a hot streak of these planes possibly being cursed. We also really start to see the tropes come in spades. The passengers on the plane include a little girl en route to the hospital for a heart transplant. Remember that scene in Airplane? It's all here, but this time it's played completely straight lace. Linda Blair from The Exorcist actually plays the little girl, which is just a fun little tidbit for you. Like the first film, this cast is stacked. Charlton Heston, Karen Black, some Hollywood royalty in Gloria Swanson and Myrna Loy. There is a lot to like here. The aerial photography is genuinely super impressive, even if you can see the shadow of helicopters filming the plane in midair. This is one of the last times we would see aerial photography like this. If we contrast it to the fourth film, released only 5 years later, it's all blue screen effects that have aged horribly. In a lot of ways, this film is better than the first if you don't care about plot and are just looking for disaster. It did well in the box office, but remember how I said that Airport kind of launched the disaster film genre? Well, it may have been a bit too effective, as Airport 75 ended up only being the third highest grossing disaster movie in 1974 alone, losing out to both Earthquake and The Towering Inferno. However, on a budget of $3 million, its $103 million box office receipts are nothing to scoff at. And this time, we'd only have to wait 3 years for a sequel. While the first film was clearly an ad for Boeing airplanes, it's time we get an ad for the Navy that is honestly more effective than anything Tom Cruise has touched. The first 2 installments featured air disasters, but while this starts in the air, it ends in the ocean. Airport 77 stars James Stewart, yes, the James Stewart, as a wealthy art dealer who is currently flying priceless works of art and dozens of his friends and family from one end of the country to the other on a luxury airliner. However, as they make their way towards Stewart's estate, the plane is hijacked and crashes in the middle of the Bermuda Triangle, stranding all of the passengers at the bottom of the ocean. It's a wild plot that honestly rivals the second film in its outlandishness. And it works. It's terrible. It's genuinely the worst of the 3. Everybody aboard the plane is useless, and they're saved by the US Navy with a coda to the film that just screams America. Also, the cast is so funny to me. Obviously, there's James Stewart, probably the biggest name in the entire franchise, and it's painfully obvious that he has no business being here. Stewart was only 68, and so I don't know if it's age or indifference, but man, he's giving nothing. He has maybe one line in the entire back half of the movie. The rest of the time, he's just blinking and pacing menacingly. The real star is probably Jack Lemmon, who is great as the captain of the plane. We've also got Olivia de Havilland, Joseph Cotten, Christopher Lee, who literally only took the role as a way to meet Jack Lemmon, and of course, our airport man himself, George Kennedy, taking up the role of consultant. Sure, why not? The film did well again, making $91 million worldwide, and it was nominated for 2 Academy Awards, including the 35th and final nomination for the legendary Edith Head. She certainly went out with a bang. As for my thoughts, no, it's not good, but it's not good in the way that I wanted it to be not good. The underwater photography is unironically impressive, and it's nice to get a change of scenery for once. It's also got great pacing, something that they finally nail after 2 previously messy installments. Jack Lemmon is good too, despite calling his appearance in the film one of the worst mistakes of his life. And while researching this video, I was pleasantly surprised to see that this movie was turned into a ride at Universal Studios in LA. From 1977 to the mid-80s, you could take part in the Airport 77 Screen Test Theater, wherein members of the audience would be chosen to reenact scenes from the film in front of everyone. These scenes would be filmed and then included in a highlight reel, where you would find yourself within the action. It's amazingly random and fitting for such a wonderful disaster of a disaster film. But for as much as I've praised the worst franchise to ever exist, I do need to mention Airport 79, or as I like to call it, the Concorde, Airport 79. Actually, that's not what I'm calling it. That's what it's actually called. I don't know why I phrased it that way. In 1979, the final film in the Airport franchise was released, and this one is actually terrible. I've mentioned the other films fall in the so bad they're good territory, but this one is actually abhorrent. The plots of Airport have never been strong, but we're at an all-time low here. The film stars French actor Alain Delon and George Kennedy as pilots of the brand new Concorde, a supersonic jet that promises to revolutionize air travel. However, our villain is Robert Wagner, an arms dealer who attempts to kill his girlfriend, one of the passengers on the plane, because she knows too much. For some reason, he decides the best way to kill her would be to launch a missile at the plane while in air. I mean, this was certainly an odd role for Robert Wagner to accept, considering just 2 years prior to this, he was a person of interest in the death of his wife, Natalie Wood, who fell off of a boat. But it was an odd role for everyone to accept. I mean, this film was just awful. In one scene, a heat-seeking missile is targeting the plane, and George Kennedy opens the door of the cockpit and shoots a flare gun, which the missile targets instead for some reason. I'm not going to argue the previous Airport films were realistic, but at least they tried. In the first film, a stowaway is handled methodically, slowly, and procedurally. We see how an airport reacts to passengers not doing what they're supposed to. But in this film, the passengers are just wild. Jimmy Walker from Good Times is here, playing a saxophone in the airplane bathroom while smoking weed. Like, what? And passengers are literally congregating by the drinks and dancing to some portable record player. I mean, it's a madhouse. The entire Russian Olympics team is here for some reason, and one of the Olympians just randomly takes his daughter to the cockpit. There's no care for these characters either. Petroni is back for the 4th time, and we learn his wife has died between films. We're not shown that he's particularly broken up by this, and in one completely random scene, we see Petroni get seduced by a prostitute. The next day, he tells Alain Delon that he had this great night with this woman, and Delon implies that he had bought her for Petroni. But unlike other films that might care for their characters and have Petroni get angry, he's kind of like, "Aw, yeah, man, nice." It's just, wow. Unlike other Airport films, this one was a failure. At initial test screenings, the film was literally laughed off, despite not being a comedy. Then, when marketing the film as an action one went abysmally, Universal changed up their strategy and began marketing the movie as a comedy. It didn't really help, though. Oh, and remember how I said the airplanes from both Airport and Airport 75 were involved in fatal accidents? Well, the Concorde here was no exception. On July 25, 2000, this Concorde suffered from a punctured fuel tank and crashed in France, killing all 109 passengers on board and 4 people on the ground. It's really just a horrible ending to such a messy franchise. And for some reason, I watched all of these films while on a plane myself. Overall, the Airport franchise was on its last legs, and when less than 1 year later, Airplane came out and spoofed this franchise so effectively, it was the nail in the coffin for future entries, and a 5th film was scrapped, but I can't imagine we're missing out on anything there. Honestly, I don't know if I made a good choice by watching these while on a plane ride, but hopefully you can watch them yourself and let me know. Until then, I'll see you at the movies.